Bree, you're the only picture that I can see. So if you can signal me if my audio goes out or if something else happens.
Sure.
That's really helpful. Okay. So hello, everybody. It's so exciting to be doing this for the first time this year. We were a little bit quicker on the draw last year. I was looking through my notes in November, we'd already done a couple. So I'm still a little bit in my first time of the year nerves. So bear with me. It's going to be a little bit of a wordy adventure, I think. I'm just going to start with introducing myself. I'm Ann Smith, and I am the head of school of Mildenhall Montessori Schools. I'm also the principal at Tattle Creek. So for those of you who might be less familiar with us, we have 3 schools in Toronto: Tattle Creek, which is at Spadina and Bloor, and High Park Gardens, which is right next to High Park, just south of Bloor. And then the Mildenhall School, which is just south of the Queensway, rather, near Islington in Etobicoke. Actually, these are my children, but I have no control over my thing again. Oh, there we go. So I am actually a former Montessori student. I myself attended High Park Gardens, just a couple of years ago. But the picture on the left there is actually my CASA graduation when the school was located at the church on Runnymede Road. And the other, I think that was like in 1980. And the other picture, that is me in early years, lower elementary, working on a reading card. So that was a little while ago. I started at Montessori, and then from there I transitioned to the Toronto French School. And then, I followed kind of a circuitous path to undergrad and graduate school in the United States. I trained as a clinical psychologist with a focus on developmental psychology, and then my PhD is in child and adolescent clinical psychology. I am also a mom. My 3 girls here are actually now 17, 15, and 13. My youngest is just completing her final year in our middle school at the Mildenhall School. And my other 2 are at the Etobicoke School of the Arts, the high school in Etobicoke. So let's see, just a tiny little bit more about me so you have some context. I raised my kids in the United States, and then we returned to Toronto when I became head of school 8 years ago. And it's an amazing opportunity, and I'm so thrilled and honored to be guiding these schools. So we have students as young as 15 months old, and we go all the way through grade 8. So our graduates are as old as 14. Tonight, we are going to specifically talk about, sorry, I can't remember what my slides are. We're going to specifically talk about how students transition. That's one of the most common questions we get from parents. How do they do, and when should we change schools? Because of course, we don't take you all the way through high school. And so I wanted to speak specifically to that and take you through an example of how things work in our schools, maybe compared to some others. So our Montessori students transition to new settings really at a few consistent points. So following CASA, so sometimes going into kindergarten, and often they leave before going into elementary. They also may transition at the end of grade 3, or at some point, not very frequently, but at some point through the upper elementary cycle. I am going to speak to those transition points, but I'm really going to focus on the transition between CASA and elementary, and the final postgraduate transition, so either after grade 6 or after grade 8. And actually, since I have a little bit of time, I'm going to do a quick overview of how our schools approach early childhood education, because that's really relevant to why people think about transition as an important question. So I'm going to speak to sort of how we approach education. I'm going to talk about the documented benefits of the approach and basically how we prepare our students just to be prepared to go into all environments at any point. If at some point you have questions or you'd like more clarification, please feel free to throw it into the chat. We will have time at the end for some back and forth discussion or questions. If for some reason we don't get to your question, or rather I don't get to your question, I will answer it in email. So make sure, share your thoughts freely. I'm happy to answer anything. And of course, at any time, if you want follow up, just give me a call. This is like my favorite thing to do, to talk about this, talk about schools and talk about children learning. So let's see, if you leave tonight with just one single discussion point in mind, something that you want to share with your partner or with your parents or with your colleagues, I would really love it to just be the following. Our schools, they focus on how children learn rather than how teachers teach. I'm just going to say that again because it's a subtle but really important distinction. So our schools focus on how children learn rather than how teachers teach. And so what that means really is that we are, oops, wrong way. We are trained and guided by knowledge of human development. So we really look at how humans, not just children, but humans overall, have characteristic sensitive periods in their lives, in their brain development, that if we are able to really deliberately match their environment to that developmental stage, the acquisition of knowledge and the acquisition of skill is fairly effortless. Really, like sort of a really easy example that a lot of people can resonate with, I think, is around toileting with toddlers. So that's always a question. When should I start? When should we get out of diapers? Is it too soon? Is it too late? Most children have a very, very strong sensitive period for getting out of those diapers. So if you start a little bit too early, you will spend weeks, frankly, banging your head against the wall, encouraging your child, talking to your child, rewarding your child to do something that they are just resisting. They're not interested in it. They might be interested, then they kind of regress, they go forward, they regress. If you are able to kind of catch that sensitive period, that toilet training can happen in like a matter of days or a week. It's really sort of that magical combination of timing and your child being ready. That's not to say that there's anything inherently wrong with starting too early or waiting too late, like kind of missing that really prime window. It's just an example of, if you could have hit that special part, because a lot of people wake up and they're like, oh my God, it just happened today. Like just today, he decided that it was, time. Imagine if you're able to sort of predict that time and take advantage of it, it makes it sort of an effortless process. So what we try to do in our schools is really understand and capture those moments in child development and set up our classroom environment, which includes how our adults in the environment work and speak and move. So really match the environment to that child sensitive period. Whether that is a sensitive period for learning language, for learning mathematical concepts, for really developing particular motor skill. We're really always thinking about the children at the heart. So rather, instead of how am I going to teach this child how to read, it's how does a child learn how to read? When we've done that effectively and efficiently, we're really laying down the literal neurological tracks that build the scaffold for all future learning. So once one skill and it could be very, very minor, it could be very big, is practiced and mastered, we're ready for the next skill. So can't run before you walk, for example. If you try to, make a child run down the street before they're walking, you're going to have a lot of trouble. But that walking really leads to the ability and the motor skill to then speed it up and start running. In our curriculum and in our approach, we have a repeated emphasis on introduction, practice, and mastery. And that starts from the very youngest, those 15 months old, and it carries all the way through middle school. So we have a really deliberate curriculum that focuses on increasing complexity. So skills are introduced to the toddlers that are continuously introduced to the middle schoolers, but with increased level of complexity and sophistication. I'm not only speaking about academic skills or academic environment, I'm also speaking to all of those executive functioning skills that we need to be really efficient, effective, capable, competent people in society. So really practicing and mastering skills related to concentration, problem solving, perseverance, planning, things like that. I want to be really clear that, of course, all schools teach children how to read and write and complete mathematical calculations, and all teachers are trained to do that. They've completed their own training in how to teach those academic skills, whether it's early years or later. Their curriculum is directed by the same provincial guidelines that we have an understanding of course. And they also have benchmark skills. The difference being they use those benchmark skills as a way to direct their teaching specifically to sort of where the whole class level is at that time. Whereas we're thinking of the individual children and where they are in their sensitive periods of development and what we want to guide them to within the environment. Sorry, I'm going through my notes and I know I'm going fast. So please, again, feel free to write down any questions or any clarification that you'd like to hear more about. So I really thought about what are critical differences or critical points that would be relevant to understanding how children transition out of our environment and when would be sort of an optimal time for that. And I really came up with two essential differences to take into consideration. So one is maybe more obvious than the other. So one is that we have 3-year cycles. And what that means is, with the exception of the toddler years and the middle school years, both of which are more like 2 years, your child spends 3 years working in the same classroom, preferably with the same teachers, not always, but preferably with the same teachers and the same children. They get an experience of being a novice in the classroom. Somebody or an individual in the classroom is like, yeah, like I get it. I've been here before. I know what I'm doing. And then in that 3rd year, they're really like the masters of the universe. They're the children who are directing all the other children. They're helping them out. They're telling them what all the routines are, what lessons they're permitted to or not permitted to take out. They really move into a lot of ownership in that classroom. So those 3 years form an entire package. What your child is doing in the course of the 3 years really culminates in those final months of that 3rd year, where you see all of this investment in their motor skill and their language skill and their interpersonal skills. They flip over at sort of some point, kind of mid that 3rd year, until you have a child who you wake up one day and you're like, whoa, like all of a sudden I have a big kid. So I've had this little kid who goes to this beautiful little school that's really sweet, and which it still is, of course, but at some point, your child has really grown remarkably, and they are accessing an enormous level of complex skill that all the work prior has been leading up to. So really, it allows us to take each child where they are at across the 3 years, and gives them each their own time to really work through that developmental period. So that 3 to 6 year period, like 3 years old to 6 years old, or 6 to 9, 9 to 12, giving them enough of a window to access the entire opportunity that is within that curriculum or within that classroom. The other essential difference that I was thinking about was in our school, we have a consistent philosophy and pedagogy about how children learn. So no matter which teacher or administrator you talk to, we share a collective understanding about how we're going to approach children and how they learn. That is not frequently the case in other environments. So we have sort of a consistency, or not sort of, we do have a consistency of pedagogy where not only do we understand what developmental period the students in our class are working within, but we have a fundamental shared understanding regarding the importance of independence, autonomy, personal responsibility, work ethic, compassion, humanity, empathy, and how to approach that and build that in children. So that simple fact means that your child can have a consistent educational experience from 15 months through 14 years. They don't ping pong between sort of styles or approaches or beliefs about learning. It's not necessarily terrible to do that. Lots of kids do great in that environment, but it is something that impacts the transition when your child has to adapt and conform to a new environment every September. That adjustment period does have an impact on ease of transition or how they might experience that. Sort of a general example might be, there are teachers who use a lot of visual aids or a lot of external reinforcers. So your child gets very accustomed to having very clear indicators of sort of their performance or their behavior in the classroom. And the following year, that teacher relies entirely on verbal direction. That transition can take some time to adapt to. So I'm going to just collect my thoughts for 1 second and see if there was another point that I wanted to make, but I don't think so. See if I can change my slides here. Oh, look, 3. Oh, there was a third point. I knew that there were 3. Amazing. Okay, this was the other one. So forgive my soapbox for 1 second, but it's an important one. The biggest predictor to success in school is match between the family and the school. I cannot emphasize that enough. So whether you feel like you are a great match with us, or you feel like you would be a great match with another setting, that is an essential core piece, because that's the difference between being partners in your child's education and your child's childhood, and being just sort of missing each other as you're trying to explain what's going on, and having sort of a fundamental difference of understanding about how children learn and how you want your child to be learning. So I'm just going to say that again, the mismatch between, or the match between, put it into a positive, the match between the school and the family or the student is the core predictor of how well your child is going to do in school, how happy they're going to be in school, and how happy you are going to be in that school. Because this is your school too, right? This is a developmental period for all of the parents, because never again in your life will you have children who just started school, or children who just started grade 1, or children who just went into middle school. And those developmental changes in your children's lives are developmental changes in your life also. So feeling like you are connected, that you get it, that you have trust, those are essential core requirements to making sure that your child is going to be successful in school, regardless of environment. Okay, I said those things. So I just want to walk you through a little bit of a difference about how we learn, or how we think about children learning, and how we set up our environment for that, and a little bit about how that might compare to a different school. So, so if you can indulge me a little bit into a dive around how we learn to read. And so we talk about how children learn to read, but this is really how humans learn to read. Okay, so this process, whether you are learning it for the first time ever, or you are learning it in a second language, or you have some kind of disability that has impacted your ability to read or learn to read, the process generally follows a very similar path. It's super hard to remember how you learn to read. So assuming that it came fairly smoothly for you, many adults can remember, or kind of vaguely recall a point in time where they suddenly realized that reading wasn't effortful anymore, that actually the effort existed in trying to not read when information is put in front of you. So if you can think, like, sort of think back, cast back, and think about a time when, often people will say they were driving and, they're watching the storefronts rather go by, and all of a sudden they realize that they're taking in, it says Metro, Shoppers, Burger's Priest. Like, I'm thinking of all the stores on the floor in a row. Like, all of a sudden that has become an automatic process. You're not sounding out the word. You're not trying to recognize or discriminate between letters. It has automated within your brain. And so it's no longer an effortful process. And so what we don't often remember is all of the pieces that went into that process. And in fact, it becomes sort of a generalized memory where we sort of collectively feel like learning to read is a process of just being exposed to reading, and that's really reinforced, right? Like, I don't know if it's true here in Massachusetts, where I delivered my kids. They sent us home from the hospital with a baby bag that had, like, important to read to your child, important to read to your child. That's the basis for literacy. So not that that's not important or a piece of it, but it's not the only piece. And in a way, it makes us feel like there's sort of a natural process to reading, when in fact learning to read is actually an unnatural process that really requires explicit training. In more conventional education, whether that's a little bit in preschool, generally in kindergarten, reading starts with phonics, sometimes whole word, again, depending on that school or that teacher's training. And activities related to reading, literacy are all language-based. So there's an emphasis on a lot of conversation, reading together, pointing out common letters, pointing out word connections. For example, your name is Teresa. That starts with T, T, Teresa. What else starts with T? Tiger, tea, telephone. So making connections between sounds and letters. And even though at that age, around age 5, there could be children in that class who are reading. There could be children in that class who have no letter sound recognition. Generally, they're somewhere in the middle. Most often, they are all receiving the same group lesson. So it's a group lesson around letter recognition, common sounds, and then shared reading, usually from the teacher to the group. In contrast, what we start, and we start this really with our toddler children, and then it really picks up speed in CASA, but there's commonalities in that toddler program. But we start with a multisensory approach. So similar to the kindergarten, we have the auditory and the language-based exercises. So similarly, like, holding an object and saying, I don't have an object in front of me, but I have something in my hand that, let's see, what do I have here? I have something in my hand that starts with the letter P. And then, of course, children, they recognize what this is, right? They start to say paper, paper. So we do it a little bit in the reverse. We don't start with the letter, we start with the object, but it's generally the same recognition process. Similar to more conventional programs, we have conversation, naming things, like naming objects around the room, for example, songs, being read to, all of those things. In addition to all of that, which again has started really early, we also have exercises and work that build our children's visual acuity, builds their auditory sensitivity, and involves a tactile experience. So our materials, and I'll show you some pictures in a minute. So we've got bells, for example. We have things that are called sound cylinders that all deliberately create different sounds to be recognized by the children. So they're training auditory discrimination. The combination of using those different areas to train that auditory pathway really builds and supports the phonetic or like phonemic awareness, because they're really training to distinguish between sounds of all kinds. They're not trying to hear the difference between duh and buh. They're also training their ears and training their brain to make more subtle distinctions between all noises, which ultimately allows them to discriminate between noise without a visual cue. One way to think of this as an adult is thinking about whether, when you're exposed to a second language, if you can read the word, does that help you hear the word? So if you can see it written and you have some understanding of how the letters sound, does that help you hear it when somebody speaks it? Most often it does. So we're training auditory sensitivity. We're also working on physical and motor movement. So a child traces with 2 fingers, will trace a sandpaper letter in the same way that eventually they will write it with a pencil. As they do it, the sound is said out loud. That combination, it really embeds in the whole body, but primarily in your brain, right? The connection between the sounds, the shape of the letter. So the recognition of the written letter to the sound gets encoded. Visual acuity, similar to auditory sensitivity, training your brain to really accurately recognize those subtle differences in shape. That's what really allows us to map sounds to letters. Because if all those shapes look the same because we don't distinguish between, you know, the single letter I and a letter T. Sound and shape connection can't happen until we can visually discriminate or tactilely discriminate for those who have vision impairment. So in fact, when they've studied illiterate adults, so adults who have not learned to read until far beyond their childhood years, it's that perceptual training and the real explicit perception that letters are different that really supports learning the sounds and the letters together. It's not just something that happens with maturation, that visual acuity. It is something that needs to be explicit, that, for example, a lowercase d and a lowercase b are not the same letter. So really explicitly pointing out the distinction. Somebody once explained it so beautifully to me, you know, that I'll use, I've got a spoon instead of a fork, but so, you know, this is a spoon. If I turn it upside down, it's still a spoon, right? Hasn't changed. Spoon, spoon. For children and for or anybody learning letters, until they've really worked on that visual acuity, the letter B, D, and P is all the same letter, right? You've taken the same shape, you've turned it upside down, or you've inverted it. So until that visual acuity develops, such that they distinguish between where the curve of that letter is, the connection between the and the shape of the letter takes a longer time to encode. That fork spoon inversion thing really consolidated that for me. Let me just show you a few pictures before I continue. So I'm going to come back to this one in 1 second. Of course, I'm starting later. Okay, so here's the sandpaper letter. Here, Leo is tracing the letter O with 2 fingers. He'll be saying the sound O for aw, or aw, I guess, for octopus. And if you look really carefully, there's a little octopus, a little rubber octopus on the corner of his letter. So he's making a very explicit connection between the sound, the shape of the letter, and the actual motion. Once the children have, and I'm going to say a word about this in a second again, but these are slightly older children, these two with the pencil, they're being watched by a younger child, obviously. They now have pencils, right? They've got the motor skill and the muscle to effectively hold a pencil and be able to move it with control over the paper. They're still doing the same exercise. They're linking shapes of letters to sounds, and they're going to write it repeatedly to work towards that automation. Sorry, I'm just so going up again. Let me just, these 2 examples, when we talk about perceptual acuity, we're doing this with all different materials. We're not doing it with just letters. So we have a lot of work that involves shape. So not only are they learning the names of shapes, they're tracing shapes, and they're noticing the differences and specific characteristics of shapes that make them that shape. Oops, sorry. So ovals. Here on the left side, Henry is tracing. On the right side, Evan and Arthur are exploring the shapes that are in the geometry cabinet so they can lift them out with a little pincer grip, which is a precursor for holding that pencil. And they can really explore the whole shape while talking about what they actually are. So they're preparing their hands to write. They are actually all practical life exercises. So if you've seen, I think I took them out of this one, but oh, here we go, pouring beans or pouring water. Exercises always go from left to right, just as we move our eyes and later our hands in reading and writing. so everything becomes natural and automated and trained and smooth. All of these multiple experiences come together to lay that foundation for reading emergence. Not just knowing the names of letters, not just knowing sounds, it's all of this motor skill, as well as visual acuity and auditory sensitivity. I just want to pause for 1 second and make a really important point, because I'm going to flip through to these little guys again. These ones. So I'm not talking about accelerating learning. So when I say that we have this multisensory approach, we do. Do I think it's fantastic? Absolutely. Does it support building all of those building blocks so that your child can really effortlessly read? Yes. Does that mean that it's accelerating their development? No. Right? So all children learn to walk at different months, different times, sometimes, you know, as far off as like 6 months, even 12 months, and fall within a completely, you know, typical expected period of development. That's just what your child or that child is doing. It's the same thing for reading and for learning. So, you know, if you think about, for example, take my walking example, you can't accelerate walking. No matter how much you want it for whatever reason, you cannot make your child walk before your child is ready to walk. Why? Because they don't have the muscle, they don't have the muscle tone, they don't have you know, the motor skill and the brain development to support that walking. You can do a ton of stuff to build those things, right? You can spend a lot of time with tummy time, lots of opportunities for overall movement, crawling, pulling up. All of those things are exercises that support future walking. If you didn't do any of those things, your child would be later to walk, right? Because their muscles are going to take longer to develop. So if you do all of those things, they may be a little bit sooner to walk than if you did nothing. But you're not going to accelerate that development and growth well outside of their window of their natural development. It's just not, like, that's just not really possible. So, I mean, you could like walk with your infant forever, holding their fingers and moving their little legs. They're still not going to walk before the rest of their body is ready for them to walk. So really thinking about that with all aspects of their development and learning, we can lay all these foundational pieces. We can put all of these building blocks in place. Some children will practice these for months and months before they are ready to really master it. And other children will practice for a few weeks before they move to mastery. It's neither good or bad. It's neither atypical or typical. It just is who your child is. They're going to internalize and consolidate at their own pace. And if you think about what we just talked about, they're not only learning the names of letters and how sounds go together. They are distinguishing and discriminating between sounds. They are holding a pencil, or I mean, literally, you know, holding a book sometimes, but their visual acuity has to develop. There are so many things that have to grow for your reader to become a fluent reader. So giving them enough time to do that, giving them the space and patience to do that. And yes, the practice, absolutely, the practice. It's just a really important thing to remember as your child is growing. I'm going to jump a little bit because, of course, I was joking with somebody that I've written like an entire university course on this. And so I'm going to jump over a little bit of content and not really take you right into elementary and through, other than to say our materials continue, right? So they get more sophisticated. Oh, I'm going backwards. I apologize. Our children, once they have some sounds consolidated, they start to put those letters together themselves to make words. They start to write before they start to read. This is one of my favorite. This little guy has spelled out, "Everything is awesome." if he didn't know the sounds and he couldn't read, he wouldn't be able to spell it out like that. It doesn't matter that it's not spelled correctly, it's spelled phonetically. This child has chosen words. The children they write the words that they are interested in. So we're always linking child interest to the work that they're doing. So this child, I can't really read upside down right now. I can see that one word says bug, and I'm not gonna take our time doing that, but we can review that another time. So when a child in our school knows how to write, he knows how to read the sounds of which the word is composed. I think that's so valuable to understand. So that, here's another little guy writing his words with a slightly different alphabet, and he has written space on the top left there, space, sharks, shocks, eat, rocks, and I can't quite see what his hand is covering there. It continues to progress until they are writing words with the alphabet so they can sound them out and then copy them in their own handwriting in their book that they can then illustrate. And if I won't ask you to lean way in the way I am, but it's this little one at the bottom, you can see his illustration and the words he has written. It says the crazy, crazy house. Okay, so that's a real sort of compare and contrast between how we would teach reading, how we believe and understand children to learn, like how they learn to read, how we prepare so many different exercises for them to really emerge naturally into reading so that it is not a torturous, boring exercise. It is an effortless process that they sort of flow into. So when should you leave? Well, the easy answer is never, right? We want you to stay forever. Literally, that would enable us to have a high school and you would never have to leave and we would go into university and everything would be dreamy. Of course, that's not actual reality. But if you are going to leave, really, really strongly encourage people to not leave before the end of a 3-year cycle. Your child has spent years, months, think of how long years are in the life of a child, right? So a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old in a CASA classroom, if they've spent 3 years in that classroom, that's 3/5 of their life in that classroom, right? So that is an enormous amount of time in their lives that they have spent getting ready for that final year. That final year is when all of the magic, all of that visual acuity, sensorial experiences, experience within the classroom really comes to bear, and they dive, into, I can't even I have no words because it's like so super exciting to see it. Does it always happen in that year? No, sometimes it happens in that first year of elementary, but we see it just really blossom and grow in that final year of really actually any 3rd-year cycle. Okay, so understanding that eventually you are going to go, right? And I can't keep you all forever. I want to talk about how they do. So how do they do when they leave us? Well, sorry, that was backwards. Survey says, so let's go to the research. Don't take my word for it because, my word is going to be they do great. But I can already hear, well, of course you say that, Anne, right? And part of why I say that is because I have the experience and I've seen it and I've talked to the children, I've talked to the parents. But the other reason I say that is really borne out by all of the research. There's a ton of research that has been done really in the last 2 decades, in part because the United States, through their charter program, has really been able to bring Montessori to the public system. And in doing so, they've been afforded the opportunity and also the responsibility to really document in an evidence-based methodology, with evidence-based methodology, how our children do. So really quickly, they do great. But the point I want you to take from this slide actually is not only do they do well within their classroom, but the gains that they have from early years continue on. So if you read that science line, so in one study, children in public Montessori from ages 3 to 11 achieve significantly higher science standardized test scores in high school. In mathematics, children in Montessori classrooms have shown higher scores in applied problem solving, understanding of math concepts, and standardized test scores. In language, they show strengths in phonological decoding, letter word identification, reading assessment, sentence structure, writing creatively. Generally, our children are much more intrinsically motivated. They have problem solving and concentration skills that other children are still working on. They have a work ethic, which is a fascinating thing to think about. And what is especially fascinating to think about is, we spend our days really thinking about how we can increase the work ethic even within our classrooms. And then we have opportunities to observe in other schools, or we have conversations with other teacher colleagues, and sometimes realize that we're talking about completely different levels of responsibility. So again, or maybe not, I don't ever mean to imply that other schools aren't great environments. There are tons of fantastic schools and fantastic environments in Toronto and around the world. But we often find ourselves in a position, because we look very different than conventional settings. We're in a position of having to really explain and justify what we do. And that's okay. I'm totally here for that. I'm also just, am conscientious that a lot of people do great work and work really hard. And I just really want to focus on what we do and what we do well. And I no longer can change my slides again. Interesting. Nope. Just one second. I'm just gonna have to escape, I think, again and start. No, I can't even escape. Ah, man. All right. Well, okay. I really apologize. So, because the next one was a good one. So I will keep trying, but it just seems to be frozen for some reason. I can't even stop sharing. Oh, maybe I can. Did I? Sorry, you guys. Okay, so I'm going to keep my slides down and I'm just going to talk because I can't keep going. So somebody wrote us a great question, and I'm looking at my clock at 7:54, but I do want to get to this question. So somebody wrote us a great question when we asked for what people might like to hear about this year. And their question was, and I'm just going to quote it. It says, "I feel that my child is in a bubble. How do children integrate as part of a bigger group? How are they prepared to deal with new environments, such as public school, or are there differences in acceptance and fitting in?" So it's such a good question, and I think it's one that honestly we can all relate to, and I feel has to do a little bit with, or maybe this is my optimism, but I think has to do with how much we really value where our children are right now and the environment that we put them in. That it feels very protective and it feels very safe, and there are, and I'm gratified to hear that. That's what we strive for, is to develop a safe, nurturing environment that all children can grow and learn in. it's sort of a terrifying thing to think, oh my gosh, like other schools aren't effective at that. So there's sort of that reflection that sometimes prompts people to think, well, so maybe I should just put them in the more difficult environment now. You know, they're going to have to get used to it one day. Why not get used to it now? You know, that's really something to think about, in the sense of, if you've got an environment that is meeting your child's needs and feels like a beautiful, happy, safe place for them, there's no rush to change them out of that. If you believe that the rest of the world is sort of cold and heartless and it's going to be challenging for your child, allowing them to grow and develop the skills so they can be resilient and strong and prepared to deal with those challenges is the best gift you can give them. When our children, and the very next slide that of course you can't see because I had another survey says slide, when our children travel on, whenever they do, what they have built within the schools are huge strengths in executive functioning, which is self-regulation. So the ability to manage your emotions and moods and behaviors in combination, to keep your whole system at a level so you can access learning, so you can access relationships. That is an enormous skill that prepares them to deal with any environment. They've built working memory. They've built planning and inhibitory control, which means they can stop themselves from doing things, which allows them to be really successful in all environments. Those are skills that predict lifelong outcomes, not just academic achievement, but also like marital satisfaction and relationship satisfaction and income potential and leadership potential. So those executive functions are really critical and are one of the things that our schools do very deliberately and intentionally that other schools speak of as something that is sort of temperamentally inborn. So, oh, they can't concentrate, or that child doesn't have very much focus, or, you know, we've been building that concentration. You're not born with concentration. You build it through practice, you know, introduction, practice, and mastery in ever complex situations. So executive functioning and then social development, and children from our classrooms have incredible social problem solving ability. It doesn't mean that they don't get into fights. It doesn't mean that they don't argue all the time. I spent today in upper elementary literally refereeing, is what it felt like today. That is their work. It's to dive into that and argue and debate and work it out. And they are building those skills every day, in part because they are given the space to do it. We don't demand silence throughout the entire day. They're not stuck at a desk learning in sort of a silo. They are required to be interacting with each other and with the adults in their environment all the time. They come out of school with a huge sense of community, huge, like very positive perceptions of classmates, and very positive perceptions of school overall. So all of these things prepare your children to be successful wherever they land after Montessori. So whether they leave after that third year in CASA and go into grade 1 in a public system, in a private system, in a different country, with friends, without friends, same thing after grade 6, same thing after middle school. You know, I know we're out of time, and you know, my last note was avoid the soapbox. That's almost impossible for me. So I am going to end on a small soapbox point, which actually is one that I made before. How you're going to make a great transition out of our school, preferably when your child is 14. Please give them that gift. But at any time, the way you're going to make it a great transition is you are going to think about the child who is in front of you, not who you were as a child, not the child you wish your child will become, not like not the grandparents' description of who your child is or their fears and worries about who your child is. You are going to think really carefully about who your child is and what is going to be the best match for your child, the child who is in front of you. Your child spends their life, their early year life in school. You spend your childhood parenting time in school. So the most important thing and the easiest transition to be made is when you have made a mindful, sort of thoughtful consideration of who your child is and what environment they are going to thrive in. So if that means that your child, you know, I don't know, it is super, super, super academic, right? Like there are some kids who, you know, academic is the end all and be all. Relationships are not that important to them, right? Like that's just not where they are. You need to think of a school environment that's going to feed that. If you don't have that child and you have a child who movement is essential, real life opportunity is essential, who loves negotiation and argument and conversation, you want to find a school that is going to meet that child. If you put them in an environment that isn't going to meet those needs, neither your child or yourself is going to be happy in that scenario. And your child is not going to reach the potential that they could have reached in a matched environment. Thank you for letting me jump on my soapbox there at the end. That's like literally one of my favorite, that's my favorite soapbox. I will fight on that hill. For those of you who can't stay, I totally understand. Thank you for hanging in with me for the whole hour. For those of you who want to spend, you know, five or 10 more minutes, I'm happy to answer questions if that's what you'd like to do. We will share the recording and I will try to consolidate my notes a little bit and share that in an email. So you'll get that information. And we'll try to write down these questions so you won't miss anything if you pop out now. So Marta, I can see your hand up. So I'll ask you to ask your question and then I'll ask if there are any in the chat. How does that sound?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
My
nice
pleasure.
to finally
nice to see you.
Put a face to an email. I'll turn on my video. Just don't get scared. I just put the kids to bed. Good evening. I have a question. Hi. And especially to kind of get more out of your last comment, because Zofia right now is 3.5. She's really thriving in Montessori. We absolutely love it. And our next step is probably going to be to put her in conventional school, and also get her to learn French, so French immersion. And we're excited about that, but at the same time, super nervous because I feel like we're going to take her out of an environment that she's comfortable with, which is Montessori and being so independent. So it's going to be a totally different system of learning, plus a new language. And how do you make it easier for them? Like, how can we encourage them? Like, what should be the signs that you look for that it's working out for them or not working out for them? How do you overcome those challenges? And how do you help them? How do you encourage it? You know, opening them up to something new, something different. How do you now say that even though for the last 3 years it was okay for you to get up and do what you want, and now you're going to say, no, you cannot do that. You need to wait for the teacher to give you permission. Like that's kind of where I'm worried about, because she's used to one system, and then we're going to put her into a whole new one, plus in a foreign language. So
great question.
In your experience, what would you say?
It's a fantastic question. So, you know, and it has the particular complexity of the second language. So let me just collect myself, because, you know, I can clearly go on and on. Okay, so one of the things that we do in school and that you can do at home is sort of the sort of the popular lingo for it is growth mindset. So, if you're looking for articles, like if you're Googling things, if you Google, how do I cultivate a growth mindset? I think there's books that are literally titled that, Cultivate a Growth Mindset, for adults and for children. So by that, I mean, when your child is experimenting and experiencing different things, they are going to fail. We all do. And developing a really great, strong attitude about experimentation and failure, and that trying things does not always result in easy success. We have to practice. Like bringing that up, being comfortable, showing your kids that you are comfortable with trying things that are hard, trying things that make you feel ridiculous, and then falling down and brushing yourself off and trying again. That all of those cumulative experiences really support your child into entering any kind of new environment. The way that we do it in school is we're really mindful about unnecessary correction. So for example, when I showed the picture of the little guy who had written "everything is awesome," or the other child who had written "space" and can't remember what else he wrote, we're not going to correct their spelling, right? We're going to really enjoy and engage and celebrate the fact that the child is expressing something. And the worst thing we could do would be like, "Oh my gosh, honey, that's so cute, but actually space is spelled S-P-A-C-E." Because immediately what you've done is you've let the air to their balloon. Simultaneously, or sort of the flip side of that coin, is you don't want to fill them with empty praise, because that gives an expectation that no matter what they do and no matter what effort they put in, it's good enough, right? So, wow, great job, great job. We hear that all the time. I say it all the time. I'm always trying to catch myself. When commentary like that is non-specific and it's so well intended, right? Like, it's absolutely encouraging. It does make a point that you've noticed what your child is doing. You might be proud of what they're doing. It doesn't give them any specific information about what was great about that job. So I really appreciated how many times you had to try to do that and you just got up again and again and again. There's a really great video that makes the rounds every so often of a guy teaching, a young parent teaching his, I don't know, she's little, she might be 4, to skateboard, and literally skateboard down a rail, and the first time you see it, I was like, no, stop, because she tanks it every time, and she's coming down this steep rail and he catches her, right, every time. And although each time I'm sure she's about to have a head injury, he catches her just enough that she hits the ground, but she's not going to really injure herself. So she experiences the impact. She experiences the non-success of that trial, and she tries again, and she tries again, and she tries again. And eventually she hits it, right? She hits what they were going for. It was super awesome and cool that she was brave enough to do that so many times. But what she really was trying to accomplish, his celebration waited for the point where she accomplished it. So Marta, I think, we are doing that with all of the children. The materials that they work with has error correction within it so that they expose themselves to not getting it quite right and then having to work it out to correct it. Any support that you can do in that arena will really support her in making a transition of any kind. And I think children are super resilient. They're super resilient. and they do adapt. The signs for non-successful adaptation, I'm going to use a slightly different example. Or no, actually, it's the same example. So we had a little guy who left us. He left us out of CASA. He went to public kindergarten. He went to public grade 1, and then he came back. Very, very bright child. Of course, we all have very, very bright children. By bright, I mean like engaged, active, chatty, talking, hand up, hand in everything. He's less of an observer, he's more of a doer. And, he was one of those children who was right on the cusp of reading and writing as he ended that second year of CASA. Went to kindergarten. They were back at sort of basics with learning the alphabet, learning basic phonetic sounds, learning simple words. And, just like, frankly, he was bored. He was bored. And he was having a difficult time transitioning into this environment where the exploration was different. The exploration was with a group instead of individual. Where he had to wait for peers, where he had to follow different verbal directions more specifically. And for him, that ended up being really challenging. And so they started to see some behaviors that were labeled as challenging and disruptive. So not waiting his turn, rolling around physically, having difficulty following directions, not completing work. And it was a mismatch environmentally between, everything that his body and brain wanted to do and what the environment could tolerate and how they approached the teaching and learning. So that's sort of an extreme example because it shows up so clearly. More subtle, most kids make a fairly easy transition. Most do because they're super resilient and they've been set up to understand what their environment is telling them. So our kids are really good at picking up on what the cues are and what the rules are in an environment. And that learning, carries them really far. So they learn really, really quickly that they do need to raise their hand to ask a question or ask to go to the bathroom or get their pencil case, from a locker, from their desk or whatever it is. So that's the long answer. So just in summary, my short answer would be to really support failure as not a big deal, as something that's totally if you have any opportunity to have a comment or anything about classroom placement, if there's a teacher that really resonates with you positively or not, and you have any way to influence that, make your voice heard, talk to the principal, whatever option you have to try to make the best match possible. Sorry, I get too excited. I can go on forever. Let me just check the chat. I saw Bobby, you came up. Hi, Bobby, I can't see you on the screen.
Just a quick thank you. That was a really good answer to my question. So thank you so much. I'll let you carry on.
You're so welcome, Marta. And if there's anything else, just give me a call. No problem.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Bobby, can you just unmute and let me know if this is the Bobby that I'm thinking of? Bobby, is this Tristan's dad?
What's that?
Whose dad are you, Bobby?
Oh, August.
August. Okay, great. I've got multiple Bobby dads. Great. Okay, so how did I decide to send my kids to High School of the Arts? And if I was going to start looking at schools after CASA, what attributes would I look for? Okay, great question. So short answer, I did not decide. My girls, that's where they wanted to go. I have one child who is very, very interested in theater and has always been, like she can name all of the musicals, even the most obscure, that have been even close to Broadway in the last decade or longer. She was devastated because the pandemic closed the theaters the day before her Hamilton tickets that she'd waited like years for. So, there wasn't, to her way of thinking and probably mine also, there wasn't really another option for her. She was going to go to a high school like that was arts strong. And the Etobicoke School of the Arts it was geographically the closest one to us, but also was slightly smaller than Rosedale. And then I'm blanking on the name of the other one that is in East York. That one was really, really her choice. So assuming that, she was successful in the audition, that was where she was going to go. My second child is a visual artist, and really same thing, like she can't imagine not doing art. And that's always been true. My third child right now is different. So she's much more of a generalist. She's not, she's sort of curious and interested in the art school, but that's more because her sisters are there rather than specific interests of her own. And so the conversations, she's in grade 8 right now. The conversations that we're having right now are a little bit about, whether or not she wants to narrow any interests, whether that's necessary. If she does want to audition for ESA, what would she audition in, and is she prepared to follow through with that? Because if she's not really interested in drama, is she ready to do 4 years of drama, fairly intensively? So that's sort of long and short of that one. And it's related to number 2, because I would say it's the same question. So what school attributes I am looking for really depend on my children. So Bobby, I'm happy to have a longer conversation with you specifically about August later. But so I would be thinking about, really thinking about your family and what August, or what your child, anybody's child, like sometimes it's really easy, right? Like it's really easy for my oldest one because drama is the thing. So that gives you sort of a pathway. If your child is one that temperamentally, I have to speak sort of in very like generalizations, right? So I'm going to speak in sort of some stereotypes and generalizations. If you have a child who is temperamentally on the shyer side, or more, people used to call those children sensitive, right? Like they're the hang back, they observe, they might be a little bit more quiet in a group. They're not shy necessarily or lacking in confidence. They're just, they're a little bit more reliant on routines, or they're a little bit more lost in a crowd. You may be looking for a smaller school, for example, because you want the classes to be a little bit smaller, because if your child is not one who's really going to assert themselves in a more conventional setting, where lessons are taught as groups, your child, if they're well behaved and quieter, may go overlooked a little bit. So, that's sort of an extreme example. Like I'm trying to exaggerate traits a little bit to give an example, but really thinking about, who your kid is can guide you around certain decisions around bigger or smaller. I'm a big advocate for fewer transitions if the match is right. So finding a school that will take your child, through the fewest transitions over time. So ideally, can you stay there through grade 8 and then transition to high school? Can you transition at grade, into grade 7 and then stay through high school, or are you going to do a jump and a jump? Many kids do fine with that. Other kids don't, so really thinking about who your kid is and thinking about duration. If you, again, there was sort of that, some schools are more, more or less, I was actually having this conversation with upper elementary. So upper elementary right now, a few of the kids are like, Anne, you need more discipline. And what they mean is I need to be more punitive. And I'm a little bit like, yeah, good luck, guys. Like, that's not, handing out punishments in the sense of suspensions or, time out. We don't do those things. That's not how we believe children learn. It's not how we think children have opportunity for reflection to address the behaviors or change their behaviors. There are other schools that have a different approach and have much more what people traditionally think of as a disciplinary approach. Not good or bad, what's the match with your family and your child? So again, what resonates for you around school and what you want for your children, and how does any school, whether it's our school or another school, describe that, support that, and how do they walk the talk? So, one really important thing is to remember that anytime you take your child to a school, it's not a life sentence. If you don't like it, if your child doesn't like it, make a change, because there are places out there that are going to be a better match. And the difference between your child thriving and your child getting along can be really vast. So, sorry, that's sort of a rambling. Did that answer your question, Bobby, or did you want me to be a little bit more specific? Oh, maybe I've lost Bobby for the moment. Okay. Any other final questions? I can go all night, you guys. Okay, so feel free. Everybody knows my email. It's just Anne, A-N-N-E, at Mildenhall Montessori. If you think of anything, please don't be shy. These are big decisions. And just because we all have kids, it doesn't mean we have access to all the same information, right? So I've lived in this world and I've worked in this world for a really, really long time. And I'm happy to talk about all of it. And just like, I would ask if I had my investment banker to give me advice and recommendations before I invested my money. I'm more than happy to have these conversations with everybody. So, my investment is in everybody finding the right place for their child and their child reaching their potential. So those are really important conversations to have. It's really, really so nice to see all of you. If I could switch it off of active speaker, then I could see all of you, but I can't. So feel free to email. Otherwise, I'll just say goodbye and thank you. Have a really great night, everybody. Good night. Oh, we can stop recording if I knew how.
Yeah, I just did.
Oh, thank you.